On the road, EWTN News Nightly travels with the Vice President to Florida as he and Presidential Advisor Ivanka Trump highlight criminal justice reform. Supreme Court bound? A religious liberty law firm updates us on their next steps in a case involving a Catholic foster agency. European heat wave. As record temperatures hit, we'll talk to the Catholic traveler with advice for pilgrims on summer vacation. And the beauty of faith. We examine a painting featuring the Blessed Mother's parents on their feast day. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, July 26, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Vice President Mike Pence and Presidential Advisor Ivanka Trump arrive in Florida today promoting the Trump administration's efforts to give prisoners a second chance. They toured a facility providing former inmates with needed resources to find work after they serve time. White House correspondent Mark Irons traveled with the Vice President on Air Force Two. He reports from Jacksonville, Florida.
Wyatt, President Trump signed bipartisan legislation late last year addressing criminal justice reform. One of the goals of that law, to keep former inmates from repeating crimes that would land them back in jail. Now, one of the highlights of this trip is focusing on an organization that's trying to get past prisoners back on the job.
We want America to be the worst place in the world to commit a serious crime. But we also want America to be the best place in the world, once you've done your time, to get a second chance.
The Vice President and Ivanka Trump visited Operation New Hope to participate in a roundtable discussion. The program provides skills training for people with a criminal history looking to get their lives on track.
The likelihood of somebody being reincarcerated if they don't have a job increases exponentially. This is in the interest of communities, it's in the interest of individuals, it's just the right thing to do.
Today's focus on rehabilitating former prisoners comes a day after the Trump administration reinstated the death penalty at the federal level after a 16-year hiatus. Catholic Attorney General William Barr also scheduled the executions of 5 death row inmates. Barr states they were convicted of murdering and in some cases torturing and raping the most vulnerable in our society, children and the elderly. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says the Church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. The second leg of this Florida trip is moving beyond inmates rehabilitation, focused on apprenticeship and job opportunities for all Americans.
And when you look at those wages rising, they're actually rising at the fastest rate for hard-working, blue-collar Americans. The forgotten men and women of America are forgotten no more, Florida.
Committed to at least 250 new job training positions as part of the Pledge to America's Workers. The Workforce Development and Apprenticeship Program is one of Ivanka Trump's key assignments. She's worked with companies across the country to encourage job training and placement.
It's amazing to see the great work that you're doing, and it really is a testament to the economic climate.
In Jacksonville, Florida, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
The House of Representatives passes a bill to protect an estimated 200,000 Venezuelans living in the United States. It grants them temporary protected status, or TPS, and shields them from deportation. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi rounds up a big week of immigration news. Jason?
Wyatt, this bill also grants Venezuelans permits to work in the United States for 18 months. The UN estimates in recent years 4 million people have escaped Venezuela. They're suffering from very high inflation and struggling to find food and medicine. This bill comes as the House once again fights over immigration.
Look, I'm going to stop. I'm not going to read this.
The top Republican on the House Judiciary Committee says he's done with all the talk and no action.
Continuing to bring the same witnesses or the same people from the same agencies to talk about this over and over and over again, what's dehumanizing is doing that and not doing anything about it.
It's one of 3 House hearings since February on the topic of immigrant children separated from their parents.
The administration's family separation policy has stained our nation and will have lasting effects on those who are subjected to it.
Border Patrol has separated less than 1,000 children of the approximately 413,000 family members apprehended.
Democrats say detained immigrants deserve better.
With some detainees going days or weeks without a shower or the ability to brush their teeth. children required to share combs during a lice outbreak.
The acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, told a different committee he needs more money.
The failure of Congress to increase funding for fugitive operations over the course of the last decade has created a tremendous strain on ICE's ability to effectuate arrests of specific aliens who have failed to comply with removal orders.
One area where the House is doing something is on TPS.
Viva Venezuela.
Granting temporary protective status to Venezuelan immigrants already in the U.S.
I want the Venezuelan people to know, both in South Florida and across Venezuela, those who have fled to Colombia, to Brazil, to Peru, that our party will never give up on them until there is freedom in Venezuela.
We have no word on if the Senate will pick up the House bill on Venezuela. And we have one more big piece of immigration news. A judge has temporarily blocked a Trump administration rule. It says that the new rule says most people seeking asylum must apply for asylum outside of the United States. And Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, the head of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, condemned that new rule. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. New legislation in Oregon shortens an initial waiting period for some people seeking assisted suicide. The law will allow terminally ill patients with fewer than 15 days to live to receive quicker access to life-ending drugs. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a statement on medically assisted dying in 2011. They said palliative care is better suited for the dignity of the human person. Two Philadelphia moms standing up for faith-based foster agencies are asking the Supreme Court to hear their case. The city is threatening the agency because of its views on marriage to change its religious beliefs or close. Joining me now is Nick Reeves, legal counsel at Beckett, a nonprofit law firm dedicated to protecting religious freedom. Beckett represents the families, children, and Catholic social services in this lawsuit. Nick, welcome.
Thank you.
Tell me how we got to this point where you guys are asking the Supreme Court now to take up this case.
So Beckett represents two foster families and Catholic Social Services, which is one of 30 different private agencies that contract with the City of Philadelphia. Back in March 2018, the City of Philadelphia said, we'll no longer allow you to place new children in the homes that you endorse and that you work with because we disagree with your religious beliefs. Two foster mothers and the agency themselves have continued to fight for their First Amendment rights, and we're asking the Supreme Court to protect those rights.
What do you think about the significance, how important this case is in the bigger fight for religious freedom?
I think there are at least two different angles to answer that question. First, in just the foster care context, there are over 400,000 children in foster care nationwide, and we need all hands on deck to help those kids. And Catholic agencies are particularly well suited to help the most vulnerable children. They're really good at placing children with disabilities, minority children, and older children, all of whom have difficulty finding loving homes. And these Catholic agencies might be shut down. So I think in just the foster care and adoption space, this is very important. More broadly, I think it's important that the Supreme Court reaffirm that religious agencies who are trying to help those in need don't have to check their religion at the door when they enter the public square and try to care for the most vulnerable in our country.
And I imagine this is so upsetting to so many people in Philadelphia because they have a long history with Catholic foster agencies.
That's exactly right. The City of Philadelphia has been doing foster care for about 50 years, but Catholic Social Services has cared for children for over 100. They used to care for 120 children at a time, but because of what the city has done, they now have over 60 empty beds, meaning that kids could be in these homes today, but are being prevented from caring for these children.
And like I say, we're talking about a situation in Pennsylvania, but we've seen faith-based agencies in Massachusetts, Illinois, California, the District of Columbia, all being forced to shut their adoption foster care services because of the beliefs that the children should be placed with a married mother and father. What are sort of the national implications? We look at the bigger picture here when courts don't support people with traditional values.
I think that's exactly right. It prevents them from caring for the most vulnerable in need. And, that's one area where individuals with a faith background are most effective. 45% of Catholic Charities adoptions are of children with a learning disorder or with a disability, and other agencies don't have that same kind of record. There is space for a diversity of viewpoints, and these Catholic and other Christian adoption agencies bring that diversity, and they're able to recruit families who might not otherwise choose to adopt, specifically because those families want to work with an agency that shares their religious beliefs.
Okay, well, we'll continue to follow this case and see if it gets all the way to the Supreme Court. Nick Reeves, legal counsel at Beckett. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
North Korea says the 2 missiles it fired into the ocean yesterday were a warning to South Korea. The communist country announced today it is testing a new type of tactical guided weapon. The North Korean says yesterday's launch is a solemn warning. Their leader, Kim Jong-un, is not happy the U.S. and South Korea plan to hold military exercises next month. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI made a surprise visit to Castel Gandolfo, the papal summer residence. It's the first time in 4 years Benedict has visited the residence. He walked the garden paths while praying the rosary and visited a 15th century religious sanctuary for a short prayer before returning to the Vatican. Benedict XVI spent most of his summers as Pope at Castel Gandolfo, enjoying the area's slightly cool temperatures compared to Rome. Italy's Ministry of Health issues a heat alert for Rome. Temperatures have reached in the mid-90s, with feels-like temperatures more than 100 degrees. Tourists are having a hard time dealing with it.
It's been a little bit rough. It's pretty hot back home too, but it's certainly been hotter since we've been here. So definitely got some sunburn, and it's been a struggle, especially not everywhere has air conditioning, but we're making it through. It's worth it.
Earlier today in St. Peter's Square, our cameras found visitors looking for water and shade. Our next guest, Mountain Butorik, the Catholic traveler, has personally led 400 private pilgrimages in Rome last year. Mountain, welcome into the broadcast. You call yourself the Catholic traveler. What makes a Catholic traveler? What do you mean by that?
Well, it's anybody can visit Rome as a tourist, but I like to lead pilgrimages for people that are here for spiritual reasons. So that's where we get the Catholic traveler.
And of course, you have the perfect name for it, being that you are Mountain. So what sites do you suggest someone visit in Rome besides just the Vatican?
So in Rome, I think, there are over 900 churches, and a lot of them are very special to our history as a church. But my favorite ones to visit are the ones I call the Life of Christ churches. So like St. Mary Major, where they have part of the manger, the Scala Santa, where they have the stairs Jesus climbed when he was condemned to death. And a special one for a lot of people is Santa Croce, where they have the relics of the Passion. And a lot of these churches are pretty much always empty, which is crazy, because I think that they're even better than, say the Colosseum or even the Vatican museums.
Well, we know it's hot in Rome right now. What's your best advice for pilgrims who are planning their summer vacation, or at least on their way there right now?
I think the most important thing to do is to plan well, but stay flexible. It is Rome after all, so things pop up like metro strikes and things like that. But if you plan well, then you can get out early when things are not so crowded. So when the museums are empty, when the piazzas are empty, and then you can plan a little repose or a little break in the afternoon to take a nap like the Romans do, and then get back out again in the evenings. Because so many people come here and they like to sleep in and kind of dawdle around in the morning. And then by the time they go out, it's crowded and miserable, and people just have a bad time. And especially with this heat, it's so hot that you really do need to take advantage of the early hours when it's cool.
A record 5 million tourists visited the Vatican museums in 2011. As tourists walk past all of these historical sites in the Eternal City, what's your advice about how to spot the best tourist attractions?
Well, the best tourist attractions, they're popular for a reason. They are important and people like to see them. But I think really the best thing to do is to get off the tourist path and pop into the churches along the way. Because, there's a reason that 5 million people visit the Vatican museums because of the art. But the truth is that it's a rough experience for a lot of people because it is so crowded. And so I think it's good to avoid as much as you can the crowded places.
And I'm sure that's one of the reasons why you have organized do your own kind of tour group. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you decided to start doing it?
Well, I fell in love with travel about 20 years ago, and I really wanted to find my niche. And so I started to piece together, I love the Catholic faith, I love travel, why not organize pilgrimages? And so that's what I started. My first pilgrimage was 15 years ago. And I just planned my trips based on the things that I would like to do. So giving people more time and places to pray, not rushing people around, trying to avoid the busy season, the hot season, and just give people a chance to explore especially the Rome that I know and love.
Mountain Butorik, the Catholic traveler, thanks so much for giving us all the advice and telling us about all of those important spiritual stops.
All right, thank you.
The heat in Europe has officials in Paris worried about the Notre-Dame Cathedral. They're not worried about another fire at the 850-year-old structure. Instead, they're concerned the heat could erode the stonework. In April, a fire started in the central of the cathedral's roof and nearly destroyed the entire building before it was put out. Yesterday, temperatures reached 108 degrees, the highest ever recorded there. Coming up, the author of a new book explains the importance of the practice of priestly celibacy and spiritual fatherhood, and remembering the former Archbishop of Havana. Welcome back. A Catholic author and priest says clergy celibacy is more vital now than ever in wake of the sex abuse crisis. His new book connects priestly celibacy to spiritual fatherhood. Why Celibacy, Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest by Father Carter Griffin, explains in detail how the gift of celibacy allows priests to more faithfully serve the church. Father Carter Griffin joins me now in studio. Father Carter, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Great to be back.
Define for me spiritual fatherhood and tell me how you see that directly connecting to celibacy.
Yeah, I think every man, I think, is called to be a father in different ways. And a priest is called to be a spiritual father, which means I think fatherhood is mainly comprised, there's so many aspects to it, but I think certainly being a provider for his family, being a teacher and a guide, and also being a protector of his family. And I think those things kind of apply across the board biologically, naturally, and spiritually. I think a Catholic priest is called to be a spiritual father. By the way, I also think that natural fathers are called to be spiritual fathers in their own families, as in those three ways in particular, being a provider, being a guide and a teacher, and being a protector.
With so much recent attention on the clergy sex abuse crisis, I'm glad you took that head on. And it was interesting when you said that clergy members become dangerous predators and when their superiors don't stop them.
Right.
It's not celibacy that's the problem. It's a failure of chastity, not celibacy. Explain that to me. Explain the difference.
Yeah, I think that just like, for anybody, married, not married, celibate, that all of us are called to be those who give life to others. And all of us, I think anyone can fail in that. We can, that we all are called to live chastity, which is to say fidelity, and that, failures in that regard should be attributed to those failures, not to sort of the condition that caused it. I've often said, celibacy causes sex abuse the way that marriage causes adultery. You can get rid of adultery by getting rid of marriage, but at what cost? I think celibacy, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is to say that celibacy is not just something that we kind of put up with for the priesthood, but is actually as a very positive gain. That by living our celibacy well, we actually bring a lot of life into the world. I have personally, anecdotally experienced that in my own priesthood. And so I think celibate men who bring so much good into the world, just like natural fathers, need to be held to the standards of their vocation. We need to be faithful to our vocation just like a married man does. And I think failure to do that is what we need to address. And forming men, selecting men and forming men well in order to be faithful is where we need to focus.
What are some of the reasons you say optional celibacy would be a mistake?
Yeah, well, in my opinion, I think optional celibacy sort of misses the mark on a number of fronts. I think, first of all, it wouldn't necessarily fix anything regarded to the sex abuse crisis, right? We all know that the majority of sexual abuses occur within families, among married people. And so we have to really address that problem head on rather than trying to sort of dismantle something that I think could actually be a source of renewal in the priesthood. But the other thing to keep in mind is that there is one priest of the new covenant, and it's Jesus Christ. And he is our priest, and he is our celibate priest. There is a sense in which that celibacy, that is to say, this capacity to live our love with a wide open heart, ready to receive anyone who comes to us, is something that our Lord practiced, and it's something that is sort of, I believe, sort of the norm of the priesthood. And so by saying it becomes optional, it's not to say that everything would fall apart, but I think it would make it a lot harder for young men to discern this beautiful charism of celibacy if marriage is an option, frankly, or down the road. Mm-hmm. And so I think we would have a positive loss if we did. And so that would be my opinion. I recognize that there certainly are married priests. I know many married Catholic priests who used to be Episcopalians or whatever, and they're wonderful, holy men. But I think they themselves would sometimes be the first to say that the total vocation of marriage and the total vocation of priesthood really normatively should be separated.
And it's also a good reminder our discussion is to continue for all of our people out there to continue to pray for vocations because it is so important. Father Carter Griffin, author of Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest. Thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Former Archbishop of Havana, Cuba, Cardinal Jaime Lucas Ortega dies at the age of 83. Ortega helped organize the first papal visit to the communist Cuba in 1998. He also helped open a dialogue between Havana and the U.S., which led to two countries resuming relations in 2014 after Presidents Raul Castro and Barack Obama discreetly asked Pope Francis for help. Up next, how the Blessed Virgin Mary's parents are depicted in art. Welcome back. Today marks the feast day of Saints Joachim and Anne, parents of the Blessed Virgin Mary. In celebration, we take a look at the painting Joachim and Anna giving food to the poor and offerings to the temple. The work by artist Andrea Di Bartolo is housed in Washington at the National Gallery of Art. Dr. Jim Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith, joins us now. Jim, welcome back into the broadcast. Tell us about these figures, St. Joachim and St. Anne, and how are they usually depicted in art?
Sure. Since the Gospels make no mention of the parents of Mary, what we know about St. Joachim and St. Anne comes from writings and sources outside the Gospels, apocryphal writings. What we are certain is that the parents of Mary and the grandparents of Jesus were faithful to God, deeply faithful to God and to each other. Why? Because out of their faithful love came Mary, the one who God chose to bear his son into the world. So artists usually depict the faithful love of Joachim and Anne. They show them at the birth of Mary, and they show them when they bring Mary to the temple to present her to God.
Very important moment. Let's go into this scene in particular too, because this painting that we're looking at today has some interesting, various people in it. It's a very interesting scene. Tell us about it.
So the artist Andrea Bartolo highlights the virtues of Joachim and Anne. He wants us to really focus on what it is that made them a saintly couple. And so, according to legend, the parents of Mary were known for their generosity. Generosity to God that was expressed in their generosity, especially to the poor. And so we see on the left, St. Joachim, he is giving bread to the poor and the sick. We see some of them on crutches. We see others in torn and tattered clothes. And then we see St. Anne at the center of the painting. She is giving, with a group of children, she's entering the temple and giving to the temple some sacks of grain, again, an offering. This is a wonderful preview of what we will see some years later when Joachim and Anne bring Mary to present her to God in the temple.
So what do you think we can learn about these two saintly figures from this 15th century painting?
St. Joachim and St. Anne are the patron saints of grandparents, and Mary would have learned to be generous to God by watching the example of St. Joachim and Anne, their generosity. So we see that. I think we also see their faithful love for each other, from which came Mary. We see their trust and deep faith that God would in fact bless them with a child, even in their old age. And then, of course, we see their generosity in this painting, the generosity to God that was expressed in their love for the poor. So their love, their faithfulness to God, and their generosity, all of these are virtues that we can imitate today.
And of course, today we remember and honor them both as parents and as grandparents. What kind of examples should we today as Catholics kind of keep in mind?
The example is really to be honoring the generations, right? To be honoring generations that go before us, both in the way we respect them, but also in the way we live our lives in faithfulness and in continuing the virtues that they lived. So I think that's a wonderful example of St. Joachim and Anne for us today.
Well, it is so fascinating to hear about the lineage of these two figures leading to Mary and then, of course, to Jesus. Dr. Jim Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith, thanks so much for telling us about them today.
Thank you, Wyatt.
And in honor of Mary's Parents' Feast Day, we wish the very best for all of our viewers out there who are parents and grandparents. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight and for this week. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.